They said you can't judge a book by its cover, but in the unforgiving Wyoming territory of 1885, appearance was everything. When the Union Pacific train hissed to a halt in Laramie, every eye was fixed on the first-class car, waiting for a lady in silk. Instead, she stepped out of the cattle car barefoot, shivering, and dressed in tattered burlap that barely clung to her frame. The town laughed. The wealthy rancher who had paid for her ticket turned his back. But one man, a cowboy with eyes like flint and a heart buried under years of grief, saw something no one else did, a diamond in the dust. This is the story of how a woman with nothing became the queen of the frontier. The wind in Laramie didn't just blow, it bit. It carried the grit of the high plains, stinging the eyes of the crowd gathered at the train depot. It was a Tuesday in late November, the kind of grey, steel-skied day that promised a hard winter, yet half the town had turned out. They weren't there for the mail or the supplies. They were there for the spectacle. Bo Mercer leaned against a wooden pillar, his hat pulled low to shield his eyes from the biting dust. At 32, Bo was the largest landowner in the valley. The Double Bar M Ranch stretched as far as the Cheyenne Ridge, running 3,000 head of cattle. He was a man built of hard work and silence, his shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of his legacy, but his face wore the lines of a man who hadn't smiled in years. Beside him stood Gideon Holt, the town's banker, and a man who wore his greed like a cheap cologne. Gideon smirked, adjusting his silk tie. "Nervous Mercer?" Gideon asked, his voice oily. "A mail-order bride. It's a desperate move, even for a recluse like you." "What was her name? Lydia?" "Her name is Miss Prentice." Bo said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in his chest. He didn't look at the banker. He kept his eyes fixed on the iron rails, stretching into the horizon. "And it's none of your business, Holt." "It becomes my business if she can't handle the winters." Holt chuckled, lighting a cigar. "That land of yours needs a strong woman. If she dies on you, like the cattle in 81, don't come asking me for a loan for the funeral." Bo's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his cheek. He had sent for a wife because the silence in the ranch house had become deafening. He didn't need love. He wasn't sure he was capable of it anymore, but he needed a partner. The letters from Miss Lydia Prentice of Ohio had been sensible, articulate, and devoid of the romantic nonsense that usually filled such correspondence. She claimed to be a school teacher, sturdy and ready for work. The train whistle shrieked, cutting through the wind. The massive iron engine chugged into the station, steam billowing in thick white clouds that obscured the platform. The brakes squealed, metal grinding on metal, until the beast came to a halt. The conductor stepped down, placing a stool for the passengers. The crowd held its breath. First came a businessman in a grey suit, then a family of 4. Bo straightened up, adjusting his leather gloves. He expected a woman in a traveling suit, perhaps modest but respectable. No one else stepped off the passenger car. "Looks like you've been stood up, Mercer." Holt laughed, the sound grating. Then from the rear of the train, from the sliding door of a freight car usually reserved for livestock and grain, a figure jumped down. The crowd gasped. A hush swept over the platform, louder than the wind. It was a woman, but she looked more like a ghost of the plains. She was thin, painfully so. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was matted and escaping a torn scarf. She wore no coat. Her dress was a patchwork of grey rags, stained with grease and soot. The hem ripped to reveal ankles that were blue with cold. Worst of all, she wore no shoes. Her feet were wrapped in layers of burlap sacks, tied with twine. She stood on the wooden platform, shivering violently, clutching a small, distinctively carved wooden box to her chest as if it contained the crown jewels. "Good Lord," a woman whispered nearby. "Is that her?" Bo felt the heat rise up his neck. He stepped forward, his boots heavy on the planks. He saw the conductor sneer at the woman. "Move along, rag-picker," the conductor barked. "You can't loiter here." The woman looked up. Her eyes were what the color of stormy seas, framed by dark lashes that stood out against her pale, dirt-streaked skin. She didn't look at the ground in shame. She looked straight at the crowd, scanning the faces with a desperate, terrifying intensity. "I am looking for Mr. Bo Mercer," she said. Her voice was hoarse, cracked from dehydration, but it carried a steel spine. It wasn't the voice of a beggar. Gideon Holt burst into laughter. "Well, Bo, she certainly is. Economical. Did you order her from the discount catalogue?" The townspeople tittered. The humiliation burned in Bo's gut. He was a proud man, perhaps too proud. He had expected a partner, not a charity case. He felt deceived. The letters had described a capable woman, not a vagrant. He walked up to her, his shadow falling over her small frame. She flinched just slightly, then held her ground, tilting her chin up to meet his gaze. "I am Bo Mercer," he said, his voice cold. She let out a breath that shuddered through her entire body. "Mr. Mercer, I am Lydia Prentice." "You're the school teacher." He looked pointedly at her burlap-wrapped feet. "I am," she whispered, her teeth chattering. "You look like a runaway," Holt shouted from behind Bo. "Sheriff, maybe we should check if she's wanted for theft." Lydia's eyes darted to Holt, flashing with sudden anger. "I am no thief. I am a survivor." Bo saw the way her knuckles turned white around the wooden box. He saw the bruises on her wrists fading yellow and green. He saw the sheer exhaustion in her posture, a fatigue that went down to the bone. And yet she was standing. She hadn't collapsed. He unbuttoned his heavy sheepskin coat. The wind whipped his flannel shirt, but he didn't care. In one fluid motion he shrugged the coat off and draped it over her shoulders. The weight of it nearly buckled her knees, but she grabbed the lapels, pulling it tight, her eyes closing for a brief second as the warmth hit her. "Get your wagon, Holt," Bo said over his shoulder, not looking back. "And keep your mouth shut." He looked down at Lydia. "Can you walk?" "I walked 300 miles to get to the train in St. Louis," she said, her voice trembling, but fierce. "I can walk to your wagon." "You don't have to," Bo said. Before she could protest, he bent down and scooped her up into his arms. She was light, alarmingly light, like a bird made of hollow bones. She gasped, stiffening her dirty hand, instinctively coming up to push against his chest. But then she slumped, the adrenaline finally leaving her. "My box!" she panicked. "I've got it!" he grunted, holding her tight. He carried her through the staring crowd, past the snickering banker, past the judgmental whispers of the town matrons. He walked straight to his buckboard wagon, placed her gently on the seat, and climbed up beside her. He snapped the reins. "Hyah!" The horses lunged forward, leaving the town of Laramie behind. He didn't ask her a single question. Not yet. He just drove his anger simmering, not at her, he realized with a start, but at the world that had reduced a woman to this. The ride to the Double Bar M took 2 hours. For the first hour, the only sound was the rhythmic thud of the horses' hooves and the creaking of the wagon wheels over the frozen ruts. Lydia was lost in the depths of his sheepskin coat. Her head bowed. She kept drifting into sleep, and jerking awake, terrified, she was back on the freight car. Bo watched her from the corner of his eye. Up close, the damage was more apparent. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. The skin of her face was wind-burned, but underneath the grime, the structure of her face was elegant. High cheekbones, a straight nose. She held herself with a dignity that rags couldn't hide. As they crossed the boundary line of his property, marked by a split-rail fence, Bo finally spoke. "The letters," he said, his voice cutting through the wind. "You wrote a fine hand. You quoted poetry. You didn't mention poverty." Lydia straightened, clutching the wooden box tighter. "I wasn't poor when I wrote them, Mr. Mercer. And I wasn't poor when I left Ohio." Bo looked at her. "Then what happened?" She took a deep breath, staring out at the rolling plains that were turning purple in the twilight. "I had a trunk. I had 3 wool dresses, 2 silk ones for Sunday. I had books. I had my grandmother's silver hairbrush. I had $200 sewn into the lining of my coat." She paused, swallowing hard. "The train stopped in Chicago. I had to transfer. A man offered to help me with my trunk. He had a porter's uniform. I trusted him." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "I was foolish. He led me to a side alley, said it was a shortcut to the connecting platform. There were 2 others." Bo's hands tightened on the leather reins until his knuckles popped. He knew the world was cruel, but hearing it spoken in her soft, broken voice made his blood run hot. "They took everything," she whispered. "My trunk, my money, my coat. They took my shoes because they were fine leather." She turned to look at him, her eyes burning. "They didn't touch me. I fought. I screamed and bit one of them until he bled. They panicked and ran with the goods. But they left me with nothing but the dress on my back and this box which I had hidden under my shawl." "Why didn't you go to the police?" Bo asked. "I did. They laughed. Said a woman alone in an alley asked for it. They said without money I couldn't prove who I was." She looked down at her burlap-wrapped feet. "I had a ticket to Laramie. It was in my pocket. It was the only thing they didn't find. So I hid. I snuck onto the cattle cars because they wouldn't let me in the passenger coach looking like this. I ate grain meant for horses. I drank from water troughs." She turned to him, her gaze fierce. "I am not a beggar, Mr. Mercer. I am a teacher. I am the daughter of a physician. I promised you a wife who could work and build a life. I intend to keep that promise. But if you wish to send me back because I have no dowry, you must say so now. I will not beg you for charity." Bo pulled the horses to a sudden stop. The wagon rocked. He turned on the bench, facing her fully. The sun was setting behind him, casting his face in shadow, but his eyes were piercing. "You fought 3 men?" he asked. "I bit one," she corrected. "Hard." For the first time in 5 years, the corner of Bo's mouth twitched upward. It wasn't quite a smile, but the ice in his eyes cracked. "Holt the man at the station, he thinks you're weak," Bo said. "He thinks the winter will kill you." "Mr. Holt looks like a man who has never missed a meal in his life," Lydia retorted sharply. "I walked barefoot through a Chicago rail yard in November. I think I can handle Wyoming." Bo looked at her tattered hands, then at the vast, empty land around them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean handkerchief. He handed it to her. "Wipe your face, Miss Prentice. We're home." He snapped the reins again. As the wagon crested the final hill, the ranch house came into view. It was a sprawling 2-story structure made of rough-hewn logs and stone smoke curling invitingly from the chimney. It looked sturdy, unshakable. "I don't care about the dowry," Bo said quietly, almost to himself. "I have enough money for both of us. What I don't have is someone who fights back." Lydia looked at him, surprised by the admission. She pulled his coat tighter around her. For the first time in weeks, the cold didn't feel quite so deadly. The interior of the ranch house was warm, but it felt hollow. That was Lydia's first impression as she hobbled through the heavy oak door. The furniture was expensive, heavy mahogany tables, leather armchairs. But everything was covered in a fine layer of dust. There were no curtains on the windows, just bare shutters. No rugs on the floor to soften the step. It was a house where people existed, but didn't live. An older woman bustled out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. This was Mrs. Higgins, the housekeeper, who came in 3 days a week. She stopped dead when she saw Lydia. "Mercy upon us," Mrs. Higgins gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Mr. Bow, what on earth?" "Prepare a bath, Mrs. Higgins," Bow ordered, closing the door against the wind. "Hot water, lots of it, and find some clothes." He hesitated. Lydia noticed the pause. "Find some of her clothes?" Lydia asked softly. "Your late wife." Bow stiffened. He hadn't told her about Sarah. He hadn't told anyone about the grief that had turned him into stone. "Just find something clean." Bow snapped at the housekeeper, his voice hardening again. "And soup. She needs to eat." Mrs. Higgins nodded, eyeing Lydia with a mixture of pity and curiosity, then hurried off to boil water. Bow turned to Lydia. He looked uncomfortable standing in his own hallway. "The guest room is at the top of the stairs, first door on the left. You'll sleep there until we are settled." "Thank you," Lydia said. She hesitated, then held out the wooden box she had been guarding. "Mr. Mercer, could you put this somewhere safe? It's the only thing I have left." Bow took the box. It was heavy, made of dark walnut, with intricate sovings of vines and flowers. He expected it to rattle with jewelry or coins. Instead, it made a dull, shifting sound. "What's in it?" he asked, unable to stop his curiosity. "Seeds," Lydia said simply. "Heirloom vegetable seeds from my father's garden. Tomatoes, squash, medicinal herbs, and books, my grandfather's medical journals." Bow looked at the box, then at the woman in rags. Most women would have saved a necklace. She had saved the means to feed and heal. "I'll put it in my safe," he said, a newfound respect in his tone. The next hour was a blur for Lydia. The bath was scalding and heavenly. As she scrubbed the grime of the railroad from her skin, the water turned dark grey. She washed her hair 3 times with a bar of harsh lye soap until the honey gold colour returned. Mrs. Higgins brought her a dress. It was a dark blue wool, high-collared and severe. It was clearly old-smelling of cedar and lavender sachets. It was a little big in the waist, hanging loosely on Lydia's emaciated frame. But it was warm. When Lydia descended the stairs, she looked like a different person. She was still too thin, her cheekbones sharp enough to cut, but her skin was scrubbed pink, and her hair was braided neatly down her back. She found Bow in the dining room. He was sitting at the head of a long table, set for 12, eating a piece of steak alone. He looked up, and his fork paused halfway to his mouth. For a moment, the silence stretched. Bow felt a strange thud in his chest. She was beautiful, not in the soft, doll-like way of the women in town, but in a striking, elemental way. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair to his right. Mrs. Higgins brought a bowl of beef stew. Lydia ate slowly, forcing herself not to wolf it down despite the hunger clawing at her stomach. She had manners. She would not let him see her as an animal. "Tomorrow," Bow said, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. I'll take you into town to get proper boots and fabric." Lydia paused. "I cannot pay you back yet, but I will work. I can cook, though Mrs. Higgins seems capable. I can keep the books. I noticed your ledger on the desk in the hallway is disorganized." Bo raised an eyebrow. "You looked at my ledger." "I glanced," she said. "You have uncollected debts from 3 months ago, and you're overpaying for grain." Bo set his glass down. "You know the price of grain." "I know arithmetic," she said calmly. "And I know when a man is being cheated because he's too busy working the land to watch the pennies." Bo leaned back, studying her. This was the twist he hadn't expected. He thought he was saving a damsel. Instead, he might have just hired a business manager. "We get married on Sunday," Bo said abruptly. "The preacher comes out once a month. It'll be a small service, just us and the ranch hands." "Very well," Lydia said. Then she looked him in the eye. "But I have a condition." Bo frowned. "You're in my house, wearing borrowed clothes, eating my food, and you have conditions." "One condition," she said firmly. "You will not treat me like a guest, and you will not treat me like a charity case. I am your partner, or I am nothing. If I am to be your wife, I need to know this ranch. I want to learn to ride. I want to understand the cattle. I will not sit in this house and embroider while you work yourself into an early grave." Bo stared at her. His late wife Sarah had hated the ranch. She had hated the dirt, the smell of the cows, the isolation. She had spent her days pining for the city until the fever took her. "You want to ride?" Bo asked. "It's 10 below zero." "Then buy me a warm coat," Lydia said, "and I'll ride." Bo let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a rusty sound. "All right, Miss Prentice. We'll see how you handle a horse. But first we have to handle the neighbors." "Mr. Holt," she guessed. "Worse," Bo said darkly. "His wife, and the sewing circle. They're coming tomorrow to welcome you, which means they're coming to inspect the goods and see if you're trash." Lydia straightened her spine. She remembered the 3 men in the alley. She remembered the cold of the cattle car. A few gossiping women seemed trivial in comparison. "Let them come," Lydia said, taking a sip of water. "I have nothing to hide, but they might be surprised by what they find." Bo looked at her, and for the first time he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the winter wouldn't be so cold this year. But neither of them knew that Gideon Holt was already in town, drafting a telegram to Chicago digging for dirt on Lydia Prentice. And what he would find would threaten to burn the double-bar M to the ground. The next morning broke with a deceptive calm. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, the kind that makes the snow blind you. Lydia was up before dawn. She had spent the night in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She was safe, warm, and fed, but she was essentially a stranger in a house ghost-ridden by memories of a dead wife and managed by a man who had built walls of ice around his heart. She found the kitchen empty and started a pot of coffee. When Mrs. Higgins arrived an hour later, the older woman stopped in the doorway. Stunned to see the lady of the house kneading dough, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. "Mrs. Mercer," Mrs. Higgins exclaimed the first time anyone had called her that. "You shouldn't be doing that. What will Mr. Bo say? He'll say the bread smells good," Lydia replied, wiping flour from her forehead. "I told him I intend to work. Besides, I need to keep my hands busy. I hear the ladies of Laramie are coming to inspect me today." Mrs. Higgins grimaced. "Mrs. Holt and her gaggle. They're like crows, that lot. They peck at anything shiny." At noon, the carriage arrived. It was a fine, black rig, out of place on the muddy ranch road. 3 women descended, dressed in bustled velvet and feathered hats that cost more than a ranch hand made in a year. Leading them was Arabella Holt, the banker's wife. She was a woman who smiled with her mouth, but never with her eyes. Bo was out on the range checking the fence lines before the snow deepened. Lydia was alone. She met them in the parlor. She was wearing the plain blue wool dress again, scrubbed clean, but undeniably simple. She wore no jewelry. "So this is the arrival," Arabella purred, looking Lydia up and down as she stripped off her kid leather gloves. "Gideon told me you arrived in well less than ideal circumstances. We brought you a basket of cast-offs, some old petticoats my maid doesn't need." The other two women, Mrs. Gable and Mrs. Ford, tittered behind their hands. Lydia looked at the basket of old clothes Arabella's driver had dumped in the hallway. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she remembered her father's stoicism in the operating theatre. "Panic kills the patient," he used to say. "Control the room." "That is very charitable, Mrs. Holt," Lydia said, her voice smooth and cool as a mountain stream. "Though I fear they might be too large. I noticed the seams on your own bodice are straining quite a bit. Perhaps you should keep them for yourself, for when your condition advances." Arabella's face went crimson. The room went silent. Mrs. Ford gasped. "I beg your pardon," Arabella sputtered. "Oh, forgive me," Lydia said innocently. "I assumed from the swelling in your ankles and the flush in your complexion that you were with child. If you aren't, then I must warn you those are symptoms of dropsy. My father was a physician. If your heart is struggling to pump tight corsets, are a death sentence." Arabella's hand flew to her chest. The insult had been deftly wrapped in medical concern. She couldn't act offended without admitting she was just overweight. I am perfectly healthy," Arabella snapped, though she loosened her shawl nervously. "I'm glad to hear it," Lydia said, gesturing to the tea service she had prepared. "Please sit. I've been reviewing the ranch ledgers this morning. I noticed your husband's bank charges a 6% interest rate on the feed loans. Standard territory rate is 4. I was planning to ask Mr. Mercer why he tolerates such usury." Arabella froze. She knew exactly why, because Bo Mercer didn't pay attention to the details, and her husband skimmed off the top. If this woman in rags started auditing the books, the Holt family's comfortable skimming operation was in danger. "Bo has always trusted Gideon," Arabella said, her voice icy. "Trust is good," Lydia said, pouring tea with a steady hand. "Verification is better." The visit was short. The women drank their tea quickly and left unsettled by the steel they found beneath the rags. When Bo returned that evening, he was covered in snow and exhaustion. He stomped his boots in the hall and walked into the dining room, expecting a quiet, terrified mouse. Instead, he found Lydia sitting by the fire, mending a torn saddle blanket. "Mrs. Higgins tells me you nearly gave Arabella Holt a heart attack," Bo said, pouring himself a drink. He didn't sound angry. He sounded amused. "I merely gave her medical advice," Lydia said without looking up. "And Bo, you need to renegotiate your loan terms. Holt is bleeding you dry on the interest." Bo paused glass halfway to his lips. He looked at her, really looked at her. The firelight danced on her hair. She wasn't just surviving here. She was taking root. "You went through my private papers again?" He grunted, trying to maintain his gruff exterior. "I told you," she said, biting a thread. "I am your partner. Partners protect each other's assets. Tomorrow I want you to show me the herd. I can't manage what I can't see." Bo shook his head, a small smirk playing on his lips. "You're a relentless woman, Lydia Prentice." "Mercer," she corrected softly. "My name is Lydia Mercer." The air in the room shifted. The name hung between them heavy with promise. For the first time, Beau felt the urge to cross the room and touch her, just to see if she was real. 2 weeks later, the sky turned the color of a bruised plum. The air grew heavy and still, the kind of silence that makes animals pace in their stalls. "Blizzard's coming." The ranch foreman, a grizzled old-timer named Dutch, told Beau. "A big one. The herd in the North Canyon is exposed. If we don't move them to the lower pasture by tonight, we'll lose half the calves." Beau didn't hesitate. "Saddle up. We ride now." Lydia stood on the porch, wrapped in the heavy sheepskin coat Beau had bought her, along with sturdy boots and flannel trousers, scandalous for a lady, but practical for a ranch wife. "I'm coming," she said. "No." Beau barked, tightening the cinch on his black stallion. "This isn't a Sunday trot, Lydia. This is a rescue mission. The wind will be 60 miles an hour. You stay here and keep the fires fed." "I can ride," she argued. She had spent the last 2 weeks practicing her thighs, bruised and sore, but her seat improving every day. "Not in this." Beau set his eyes hard with fear he wouldn't admit. "If I have to worry about you, I can't worry about the men. Stay put. That's an order." He mounted and galloped off with 4 hands disappearing into the grey curtain of the approaching storm. The snow started an hour later. It didn't fall. It was driven horizontally like needles. By nightfall, the ranch house was shuddering under the assault. The temperature plunged to 20 below. Lydia paced the floor. Midnight came. Then 2:00 a.m. No sign of them. At 3:00 a.m., a single horse stumbled into the yard. It was Dutch's mare. The saddle was empty. Lydia's heart hammered against her ribs. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She ran to the mudroom. She grabbed the medical kit she had assembled from her wooden box bandages, willow bark tincture, a bottle of raw alcohol. She threw on her coat, wrapped a scarf around her face until only her eyes showed, and grabbed a lantern. She went to the barn. The horses were spooked. She found a sturdy roan gelding, a calm beast named Rusty. Her hands shook as she threw the heavy western saddle onto his back, but she forced the straps tight. "You have to find him," she whispered to the horse. "Take me to the North Canyon." She rode out into the white void. The wind tried to tear her from the saddle. She couldn't see 5 feet in front of her. She dropped the reins, trusting the horse's instinct to find the herd. Find the others, she prayed. After what felt like an eternity, she heard a gunshot. A signal. She kicked the horse forward. Through the swirling snow, shapes emerged. The cattle were huddled in a low ravine. The ranch hands were shouting, trying to keep them moving. She saw Dutch. He was holding up a figure slumped in the snow. "Beau!" She screamed, the wind tearing the name from her throat. She slid off the horse, sinking waist-deep in a drift. She fought her way to them. Beau was conscious, but barely. His face was waxy and pale, his lips blue. His leg was bent at a sickening angle. "Horse slipped," Dutch yelled over the gale. "Fell on him! Broke the leg! We can't get him up on a saddle!" Beau's eyes fluttered open. He saw her. "Lydia, go back." "Shut up, you stubborn fool," she commanded. She knelt in the snow. "Dutch, we need to splint this now, or the movement will shred the artery. Give me your rifle." "What?" Dutch blinked. "The rifle, and your belt." With freezing fingers, she used the stock of the Winchester rifle as a splint, binding it tight to Beau's leg with the leather belt. Beau groaned a guttural sound of agony, then passed out. "We can't lift him onto a horse," Lydia shouted. "We need a travois." She directed the men to cut 2 saplings from a nearby grove. Using ropes, they lashed a makeshift sled together behind Dutch's horse. They rolled Beau onto it, wrapping him in every spare blanket they had. The journey back was a nightmare. Lydia rode beside the sled, her hand resting on Beau's chest, checking for the rise and fall of his breath. Every time the sled bumped, she flinched. They reached the house just as the dawn was trying to break through the storm. They carried him into the parlor and laid him on the rug before the roaring fire. For 3 days the storm raged outside. For 3 days, Beau burned with fever. Lydia didn't sleep. She sat by his side, bathing his forehead with cool water, forcing willow bark tea between his lips to fight the inflammation. She reset the bone properly when he was delirious, her hand steady, despite the terror in her heart. On the 4th morning, the wind died. The sun came out blindingly bright. Beau opened his eyes. The pain was a dull throb now, not a jagged knife. He turned his head. Lydia was asleep in the armchair next to him, her head resting on the mattress they had dragged down for him. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her hair loose and messy. He reached out his rough hand and brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. She woke instantly, jerking upright. "Beau, I'm alive," he rasped. His voice was weak, but his eyes were clear. "Dutch told me. You rode out into a blizzard." "You would have died," she said simply. "I ordered you to stay." "I'm not a ranch hand, Beau. I'm your wife. I don't take orders." Beau looked at her, and the walls around his heart didn't just crack. They shattered. This woman who had arrived with nothing but rags and a box of seeds had walked through fire and ice for him. "Lydia," he whispered, "come here." She leaned down. He cupped her face with his calloused hands and pulled her into a kiss. It wasn't tentative. It was a claiming. It was a promise. "I love you," he said the words, feeling strange, but right on his tongue. "I don't care where you came from. You are everything." Lydia's eyes filled with tears. She buried her face in his neck, finally letting herself weep. They stayed like that for a long time, the silence of the house finally filled with warmth, but peace in the West is rarely long-lived. An hour later, the sound of heavy pounding on the front door shattered the moment. Lydia stood up, wiping her eyes. "I'll get it. It's probably the doctor Dutch sent for." She opened the door. It wasn't the doctor. It was Sheriff Miller, a grim-faced man with a silver star on his chest. And standing behind him, wearing a triumphant, sneering grin, was Gideon Holt. "Sheriff," Lydia said, confused. "Mr. Mercer is injured. He can't—" "I'm not here for Beau, ma'am," the sheriff said, stepping into the hall. He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. It was a telegram. "Lydia Prentice," the sheriff read. "You are under arrest." Beau shouted from the parlor, trying to sit up. "What the hell is this? Get out of my house!" Gideon Holt stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Not Prentice, Beau. That's an alias. The Chicago police have been looking for her. This isn't a mail-order bride. This is Lydia the Lark, a con artist." He pointed a finger at her. "She's wanted for the attempted murder of a prominent Chicago businessman, the man she claims robbed her. He's the son of a senator, and she cracked his skull open with a brick." Lydia went pale. "He attacked me. I was defending myself." "That's for the judge to decide," the sheriff said, pulling out a pair of iron handcuffs. "Ma'am, turn around." "No," Bo roared, trying to stand, but his broken leg collapsed under him. He fell back with a cry of pain. "Don't hurt him," Lydia screamed, holding out her hands. "I'll go, just don't hurt him." The sheriff clamped the cold iron around her wrists. As they dragged her out the door, she looked back at Bo one last time. "I didn't lie to you about us," she cried. "Bo, please believe me." The door slammed shut. The silence returned to the ranch house, but this time it was the silence of a tomb. The Laramie jail was a stone box that smelled of stale tobacco and despair. Lydia sat on the narrow cot, her hands still chafed from the cuffs. She didn't cry. She was done crying. She stared at the small barred window, watching the snow flurry. The town had turned on her instantly. The mail-order bride was now the Chicago grifter. Even the sheriff, who had eaten her apple pie at the church social a week prior, wouldn't look her in the eye when he brought her a tin of watery beans. "You have a visitor," the sheriff grunted on the second day. Lydia stood up, smoothing her wrinkled dress. She expected Bo, though she feared seeing him broken. It was Gideon Holt. He stood on the other side of the bars, smoking a cigar, his suit immaculate. "Comfortable, Mrs. Mercer," he sneered. "Or should I say, Miss Prentice? What do you want, Gideon?" Lydia asked, her voice steady. "I want the double bar M," he said, dropping the pretense. "Bo is crippled. He can't run that ranch alone. And now, with his wife heading to the hangman's noose for attacking a senator's son, well, the bank will have to foreclose. I'm willing to make a deal. Sign a confession. Admit you tricked Bo. I'll see that you get a light sentence, maybe 5 years, in a women's penitentiary instead of a rope. And Bo signs the deed over to me to pay for your legal fees." Lydia gripped the iron bars, her knuckles white. "You don't care about justice. You just want the water rights to the creek." "Smart girl," Holt grinned. "Too smart for your own good. You have until the circuit judge arrives tomorrow morning. Think about it." He turned to leave, but stopped. "Oh, and don't expect your knight in shining armor. I hear infection has set in. He'll probably lose the leg. Maybe his life." Lydia felt the blood drain from her face. Bo. Meanwhile, at the ranch, Bo was indeed fighting, but not an infection. He was fighting Dutch and Mrs. Higgins. "I am going to town." Bo roared, his face grey with pain, sweat beading on his forehead. He was propped up in a chair, his splintered leg resting on a stool. "You can't ride boss," Dutch argued. "The bone isn't set hard yet." "Then hitch the wagon," Bo commanded, "and bring me Lydia's box, the wooden one from the safe." "The seed box?" Mrs. Higgins asked. "Bring it." When they brought the box, Bo didn't look at the seeds. He tore through the medical journals. He found what he was looking for, tucked into the back cover of a leather-bound anatomy book, a letter. It was written on heavy, expensive stationery, dated 2 months prior. He read it, and a dark, terrifying smile spread across his face. It was the look of a wolf that had just found the scent of blood. "Dutch," Bo said, his voice deadly calm. "Get my revolver, and get me to the telegraph office. I need to send a wire to the governor." "The governor?" Dutch's eyes went wide. "Why him?" "Because," Bo said, tapping the letter, "Lydia didn't just survive Chicago. She saved a life there, too. And Gideon Holt is about to learn that he picked a fight with the wrong family." The Laramie courthouse was a stifling box of judgment, smelling of damp wool, stale tobacco, and the nervous sweat of 100 spectators. It seemed the entire population of the Wyoming Territory had squeezed onto the rough-hewn benches, eager to see the final act of the grifter bride. Lydia sat alone at the defense table. The wood was scarred with the initials of cattle thieves and drunks who had sat there before her, a tactile reminder of where she now belonged in the town's eyes. She kept her spine rigid, her chin lifted, refusing to give the whispering crowd the satisfaction of seeing her tremble. But beneath the table, her hands were clasped so tightly, her knuckles were white. She scanned the room one last time. She saw Arabella Holt in the front row, fanning herself with a lace handkerchief, eyes gleaming with malicious delight. She saw the sheriff looking at his boots, but the seat she desperately needed to see filled was empty. Beau wasn't there. A hollow ache expanded in her chest. He believes them. She thought the realization colder than the blizzard she had ridden through. Or perhaps the infection took him. The thought was so agonizing she forced it away, focusing instead on the judge. Judge Thaddeus Moore, a man whose face looked like it had been carved from a canyon wall, banged his gavel. The sound cracked like a gunshot, silencing the murmurs. "This court is now in session," Moore boomed. "Sheriff, bring the accused to the stand." Lydia stood. Her legs felt heavy, but she walked to the stand with the same determination that had carried her across the frozen plains. The prosecutor was a man named Mr. Finch, a sleek, weasel-faced lawyer from Cheyenne, clearly on Gideon Holt's payroll. He paced in front of the jury box, hooking his thumbs into his suspenders. "Lydia Prentice," Finch began, his voice dripping with theatrical disdain. "Or should I say, Lydia the Lark, you stand charged with assault, with intent to kill upon the person of Mr. Charles Vance in Chicago. You fled the scene of your crime. You assumed a false identity to infiltrate this community. You preyed upon the sympathies of a lonely rancher. How do you plead?" Lydia's voice was quiet, but clear, cutting through the stagnant air. "Not guilty. I defended myself. He was robbing me." "Robbing you?" Finch laughed, playing to the crowd. A ripple of amusement went through the benches. "Mr. Charles Vance is the son of a prominent industrialist, a man of means. Why would he rob a destitute school teacher in a back alley?" "We have a police report provided by the diligent Mr. Holt, stating that you lured him there." Gideon Holt, seated behind the prosecutor, smirked and adjusted his silk tie. He caught Lydia's eye and tapped the face of his pocket watch. "Time is up." "Your Honor," Finch continued, turning to the judge. "The woman is a violent con artist. She has deceived this town, and she has deceived Mr. Mercer. The prosecution rests on the irrefutable evidence of her flight from justice." "Very well," Judge Moore said, peering over his spectacles. "Does the defendant have counsel, or shall I appoint a public defender?" Lydia opened her mouth to speak, to say that she had no one, but a deep, thunderous sound interrupted her. Thud. Step. Thud. Step. The heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, groaning on their hinges. A hush swept over the room, absolute and instant. Beau Mercer stood framed in the doorway. He looked like a man who had crawled out of the grave to fight one last battle. He was pale, his face gaunt from days of fever sweat beading on his forehead. He was leaning heavily on a pair of crude wooden crutches, his left leg encased in bulky white bandages. But he had shaved. He wore his best Sunday suit, brushed and pressed, and his eyes were burning with a terrifying intensity. "Mr. Mercer," Judge Moore said, his eyebrows shooting up. "You are not a member of the bar." "No, Your Honor." Beau rasped, his voice rough, but carrying to the furthest corners of the gallery. "But I am her husband." He began to move down the center aisle. It was a painful procession. Every swing of the crutches required a heave of his broad shoulders. Every step was a battle against gravity and agony. The crowd parted for him, shrinking back from the sheer force of his presence. Lydia watched him. her breath caught in her throat. He hadn't abandoned her. He had dragged himself from his deathbed for her. He reached the defense table and didn't look at the judge or the prosecutor. He looked only at Lydia. He dropped one crutch, risking his balance, and reached out to take her hand. His grip was calloused, hot, and solid. "I have evidence," Beau declared, turning his glare onto Gideon Holt. "Evidence that proves this entire trial is a sham." "Objection," Finch shouted, jumping up. "This is highly irregular. The man is delirious from injury." "Overruled," Judge Moore said, leaning forward with sudden interest. "This is the frontier, Mr. Finch, not a Chicago ballroom. Let the man speak. What evidence, Mercer?" Beau reached into his jacket pocket. His hand shook slightly, not from fear, but from the effort of standing. He pulled out a yellow slip of paper. "This is a telegram," Beau said. "I received it 2 hours ago, from Governor Campbell." He handed it to the bailiff, who ran it up to the bench. Beau turned to the crowd, addressing his neighbors directly. "Mr. Holt told you us all that Lydia attacked an innocent businessman, but he conveniently left out who that man really was. Charles Vance isn't a businessman. He's a gambler and a thief who was disowned by his family 3 years ago for forgery." A murmur of shock rippled through the room. Holt's smile faltered. "And the Chicago police," Beau continued, his voice rising. "They aren't looking for Lydia to arrest her. They are looking for her to give her a reward." "Lies!" Holt stood up, his face flushing red. "This is preposterous. He's making it up." "Am I?" Beau challenged. He reached into his pocket again. This time he pulled out a folded, heavy piece of cream-colored stationery. This letter was in Lydia's wooden box, the box she carried through the snow, the box she guarded with her life. He held the letter up. "It is signed by Dr. James Prentice, her father. It details a treatment for heart failure, a treatment Lydia administered to a man who collapsed on the street in St. Louis weeks before she ever arrived in Chicago. That man was Senator Clay." Beau slammed the letter down on the defense table. "The senator credits Lydia with saving his life. The governor's telegram confirms that Senator Clay has cleared all charges. Lydia fought off a mugger who was trying to steal her trunk. That is not a crime, Your Honor. That is survival." The courtroom erupted. People were standing, craning their necks. Judge Moore banged his gavel furiously, but the noise only dampened slightly. "Mr. Holt," the judge boomed, his voice dangerously low, "did you know about this exculpatory evidence when you filed the police report?" I, Holt stammered, tugging at his collar. "I merely passed on what I heard. I have one more thing." Beau cut in his voice like a blade. He pulled out a small black ledger. It was worn at the edges. Lydia recognized it immediately. It was the ranch ledger she had audited. "While you were busy digging up dirt on my wife to steal my land, Gideon." "She was looking at the math," Beau said. "She found it strange that I was paying 6% interest on my feed loans." Beau threw the black book onto the prosecution's table. It slid across the wood and stopped right in front of Gideon Holt. "I wired the bank headquarters in Denver this morning," Beau announced, his eyes locking with the banker's terrified gaze. "The authorized territory rate is 4%. Gideon Holt has been pocketing the extra 2%. From me, from the Millers, from the Johnsons, from every rancher in this valley for 5 years. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a fuse burning down. The townspeople turned in unison toward the banker. The betrayal wasn't just about a mail-order bride anymore. It was about their livelihoods, their sweat, and their money. "Arrest him," Judge Moore ordered, pointing his gavel at Holt like a weapon. Sheriff Miller moved, instantly relieved to finally be on the right side of justice. He grabbed Holt by the expensive lapels of his suit and hauled him out of the chair. "You can't do this." "I am the bank. I run this town." Holt screamed, kicking and thrashing as he was dragged toward the exit. "Not anymore," Bo said quietly. The judge looked down at Lydia, his expression softening for the first time. "Case dismissed. Mrs. Mercer, you are free to go. And my sincere apologies for the hospitality of Laramie." Lydia didn't hear him. The noise of the courtroom faded into a dull roar. Her world had narrowed down to the man standing beside her. Bo swayed, his strength finally giving out. She caught him before he fell, wrapping her arms around his waist, taking his weight. "You came," she whispered, tears finally spilling over hot and fast. "I told you," Bo said, his voice ragged, wiping a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "You're my partner, Lydia. We ride together." Spring arrived in the Wyoming Territory, not with a whisper, but with a riot of color. The snow retreated to the highest peaks of the Cheyenne Ridge, feeding the creeks that ran clear and cold through the Double Bar M. The ranch house was no longer a hollow shell. Curtains fluttered in the open windows, and the smell of baking bread mixed with the scent of sagebrush. On the wide front porch, Lydia sat in a rocking chair, watching the sun dip toward the horizon. She looked different now. The hollows in her cheeks were filled. Her skin glowed with health, and her hair shone like polished copper in the evening light. She looked out at the garden she had carved from the hard earth. The seeds from the wooden box, the only inheritance she had managed to save, had performed a miracle. Rows of heirlooms tomatoes, squash and medicinal herbs thrived, flanked by bright orange marigolds. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention. Bo rode up on his black stallion. His leg had healed, leaving him with a slight rolling limp that somehow made him look even more formidable. He dismounted with an ease that spoke of months of recovery and walked up the steps carrying a package wrapped in brown paper. "For me?" Lydia asked, setting down her mending. "Open it," he said, leaning against the railing, a small, genuine smile playing on his lips. She unwrapped the paper. Inside lay a pair of boots. They were exquisite, crafted from the softest calf skin, dyed a deep mahogany. But it was the detail that made her breath catch. Stitched into the leather were intricate vines and flowers, an exact replica of the carvings on her father's wooden box. "No more burlap," Bo said softly, his eyes tender. "And no more running." Lydia stood up, sliding her feet into the boots. They fit perfectly. She walked to him, the heels clicking solidly on the porch planks, a sound of permanence of belonging. She placed a hand on his chest, feeling the steady, strong beat of his heart. It was a heart she had healed just as surely as he had saved her life. "No more burlap," she agreed, looking up at him. "Just us." He kissed her as the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the ranch in liquid gold. The mail-order bride had arrived in rags, a ghost of the plains, but she stood now in boots made for a queen, ruling a kingdom built on grit, justice, and an unbreakable love. What a journey for Lydia and Bo. From the freezing train platform to the warmth of a love built on respect and resilience, they proved that true worth isn't found in silk dresses or bank accounts, but in the strength of the human spirit. If you enjoyed this story of justice and romance in the Wild West, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new story. Share this video with a friend who needs a reminder that even when you're down to your last hope, your life can change in an instant. Thanks for watching.